It's September 23rd, 2011, and this is another in a series of oral history interviews of retired broadcasters, retired Jacksonville broadcasters, and we're talking to Jim Lynagh. Jim, thank you for being with us.
Happy to be here, Harry. It's a long time I've been in this studio.
Well, you weren't in this studio, you were
Another studio in the building.
In this same spot.
Yeah.
Yeah, because when you were general manager, that would be...
there were two studios.
There was the old building here.
Yes.
And that's gone completely, and this new building sits here that we are in today.
They didn't just build around it. This is a completely new building.
Well, they built the new building right beside it, and then they were able to move in very conveniently. So you were general manager here from October 1, 1968 to January 1971, 27 months.
That's right.
And interesting, the day you arrived was a very important day in Jacksonville history. October 1, 1968 was the day the consolidated government took office. And you were arriving at an old airport, Imison, so to take this job that was, and you were very young, we might add.
I was 34, I think.
And
young by the standards of the people here, frankly, at the station, who expected they were going to get it.
yes, it was a shock, I guess, a cultural shock.
It was a shock for everyone. Only Leonard Mosby, who was Glenn's assistant, and Glenn Marshall knew that I was coming.
And Glenn Marshall was one of the founders of the station. Of the 1949, the station went on the air.
Right.
WMBR then, and it was had been a radio station and got a television license, and so Glenn Marshall was general manager from then until your arrival in 1968. And at that point, I guess the Washington Post had acquired the station and decided to have a little more hands-on management.
Well, actually, Catherine Graham, who was the head of the Washington Post, her husband Phil Graham had died, and Catherine had taken over the Washington Post company only a year or two before this, and they were very fond of Glenn. They had some controversies because they wanted Glenn to be more active in affirmative action and some things of that nature. But Glenn retired because his son-in-law was a cardiologist, and Glenn had had heart trouble. And they said, it's necessary, Glenn, for you to step down for your own health. This is what his son-in-law said. And so he went to Catherine Graham and said, I've got to step down. You're going to have to hire a new general manager. By then, Larry Israel was the chairman of the board of Post Newsweek Stations division of the Washington Post Company. There were only two stations, two television stations, WTOP-TV in Washington and WJXT. And Larry had interviewed me to come to the Washington Post. Actually, it interviewed me to come to Westinghouse, who he worked for at the time, and then he went to the Washington Post and knew me, and he interviewed me and offered me the job and said, come to Jacksonville and look at it. My mother had worked in Jacksonville and had been on this very television station doing commercials for Sherwin-Williams back in those days.
Wow.
with the noon show with Dick Stratton and I've forgotten her name now.
Virginia Adder.
Virginia Adder. And so she had been on the station and I had been in the station. And as a matter of fact, when WFGA Channel 12 went on the air, as its call letters were then, I applied for a job from Nashville, Tennessee as a director here. And this was in the 50s, late 50s, and didn't get the job. Rusty Bruton was the program director at the time. I had the feeling he didn't know what a director was, but in any event, I didn't get the job. That may have been my alibi. In 1968, I was managing a UHF independent station for Kaiser Industries in Boston. And UHF independent stations didn't have much of a news department. But by then I had worked at 5 6, 7 television stations with 2 companies. I'd been transferred a lot and had been there when each of them started. And
You just didn't unpack.
That's my wife's explanation. And but I had been responsible for news departments and in news departments. But the station in Boston we were building a news department, but it was not on the air at the time. So my wife and I flew in on September the 30th and spent the day looking at Jacksonville, and on October the 1st flew out, and that was Consolidation Day. And so I flew into the old airport, we flew out of the new airport, and I accepted the job, and no one knew. It was kept a complete secret, and on about October the 10th, I arrived in town quietly. Leonard Mosby had showed me around the town. He knew. He was sort of assistant manager at that time and had hoped, I guess, to be general manager. Wonderful person, as was Glenn Marshall. Glenn Marshall was particularly thrilled because he was an old Southerner from Birmingham, Alabama, and I was born and raised in Birmingham. And he met me, and we talked about the station, and he gave me the history of government by gaslight, consolidation, all of that kind of thing. And it was an exciting opportunity for me to get back into dominant television stations with newscasts and that kind of thing.
And a really big news department.
And a very successful.
And one that was doing a lot of
acclaimed, doing a lot of wonderful work. So I took the job. On that morning that I started, we went into the conference room, and no one except Leonard Mosby and Glenn Marshall knew I was coming, and introduced me to Bill Grove and to Bob Schellenberg and to the promotion manager and the chief engineer and the program director. And there was a real sense of shock that this 34-year-old guy was coming in. Now, I started in television when I was 19 years old.
And you may have looked younger than 34.
I did a children's show when Joanne and I got married in 1954, and her friends all thought she was marrying this 12-year-old. I had a very young look in those days. And I was committed to the station. The interesting transition at that time, government in the gaslight, Consolidation Day, some wonderful investigative reports had taken place at the station. It had a fabulous reputation. It had a 70% audience of the news at that time. But the new issues were not corruption in government. The new issues were social issues when I got here. And anyone managing a television station, particularly the dominant station in the 1960s, was frightened, frankly, was apprehensive, I would say, of taking on the social issues. It's one thing to take on corruption. It's another thing to, as we did, support the court's decision on integration, the school busing situation. Mecklenburg, Charlotte had already taken place, Little Rock had taken place. Jacksonville had not yet integrated its public schools. The editorial committee at that time was Leonard Mosby, who we gave the title of Area Vice President, which meant that he was the community relations person. But I was the operating general manager of the television station, and including supervising news, editorial, and everything. And we made a decision, this is going to be tough. We will drive to all of the paired high schools, or in some cases 3 high schools that were put together, before we make the decision that this is the right thing to celebrate. It wasn't just we're liberals and we're going to celebrate the integration of the schools. We're going to see whether it should be or not. And in fact, in Jacksonville in 1968-69, the black schools in this city were run down. The libraries were not very well kept up. And there were even the crosswalks over the top of the the highway ramps where the white and black students would cross each other going to the high schools. So we went to all of them, and we had a meeting and said, we have no alternative but to support the school busing plan. It's the only fair thing to do. It was not separate but equal. And we came out with that editorial with my having great apprehension of what it was going to do to our ratings and to the town and what the response would be. It did not hurt the station at all. I've tried to remember the name Cecil, it seems to me, of the
Cecil Hardesty.
Cecil Hardesty was the superintendent of education here, and he was very supportive of what we did. We had a terrific relationship with him, and we got through that. We kept the 70% of the news. There were 3 stations in town, but only 2 of them did news.
Well, is it possible that the 70% audience helped you get through it, in the sense that people who were unhappy with what the station was doing on race couldn't afford to protest by not advertising on Channel 4?
Yes, and I think the advertising was going to stay because of the ratings. My fear was the ratings, whether the audience would turn us off. I never ran into any real resistance, either by advertisers or by the audience. The audience stayed and the advertisers stayed. And that was very gratifying and reassuring to me about Jacksonville, because that certainly hadn't been the truth in Birmingham, where I grew up. It hadn't been the truth in Little Rock. I was at Oxford, Mississippi when James Meredith was registered representing a television station. So it was a terrific situation.
Well, I think when you were general manager, the station for the very first time had a fully functioning, very interesting editorial board that helped formulate policy and actually voted to make decisions on what the station's position would be.
That's right. And we got, as far as I can tell, virtually unanimous support for doing it, because we'd all driven to these schools.
But what people couldn't always understand, and Bob Schellenberg commented about this, was how you could have an operation where the boss, the general manager, could occasionally get outvoted if the editorial board came down on a position one way. The general manager might have disagreed, but had to stick with the system of having a meaningful editorial board. Well,
one of the things that was a Washington Post policy was the sales department could not participate in the editorial board. It was the news department, it was the management, it was the investigative reporter, but the sales department had no say in what our editorial positions were. I would have acquiesced if there was a large majority of the members of the editorial board who took a different position, because they had the experience in town. If it became a philosophical thing, then it might have been a bit different. But if it were a real issue that affected Jacksonville, I certainly hadn't been here long enough to say, hey, you guys don't know the station as well as I. So I would certainly be willing to accept the majority opinion.
And editorials were an important part of the station's presentation. I think, sadly, fewer and fewer stations nowadays are editorializing for various reasons.
It's sad to me, because I went through the era when I was program director of a station in Shreveport, Louisiana at an earlier time, and the news department reported to me. And we had moved in from Texarkana, Texas. We covered James Meredith at Ole Miss. We took a positive, affirmative position editorially. And the city put, we had moved from Texarkana, Texas to Shreveport, put stickers on the sidewalks, KTAL, go home. The call letters were KTAL. I mean, that was part of what made me apprehensive, because the town had such a reaction to it. But one other story in the whole integration thing that I think is interesting. I was made a member of the Rotary Club. Not many people know how the Rotary Club works. There is a member from each industry, but they can have an additional member. And Glenn Marshall was the member of the Rotary Club of downtown Jacksonville, which was one of the early ones. And I was named his additional active. If the additional active resigned, retired, died, moved, the additional active under normal circumstances became the senior member in that category. I had gone to the president of the Jacksonville Rotary Club at one point and said, you know, this city has black business people, it has black city council members. We'd already gone through the consolidation and what have you. We should have black members. I'm ashamed to say I didn't say we should also have women members. Amy McCombs, who was my successor two removed, got that done. Mm-hmm. But I said to him, and I don't remember his name now, we should have black members. And his response was, Jim, we really should. But what would we do when we had a dance? And to me, it was a mind-blowing experience, but I'm reading a biography of Birmingham, Alabama, my home, from 1940 to 1970, and what they went through, and Bull Connor, and bombing churches, and all of that. Jacksonville did not go through that kind of situation. But it was also hard to integrate things. Amy ultimately, they did integrate them. They integrated them with both women and minorities.
I wonder which came first and when.
You know, I don't know. I have the suspicion that we got African American members before we got women members.
Well, and I remember probably during your era when the editorial board would invite people to have lunch with us occasionally to get input and so forth. And some of those lunches would be in the River Club. The River Club did not allow black people to come and have lunch there.
That's right.
And
or the University Club.
The University Club. And so we kind of broke ground there in terms of having the president of Edward Waters College or someone come have lunch with us. And I also tell a story. I'd like to hear your point of view. There was some apprehension here at the station after you had done some
affirmative action
about having a Christmas party, an integrated Christmas party. It just wasn't something that had ever been done. And you said, no problem, we'll have it. We'll have it at the Robert Meyer Hotel downtown.
And we did, and nothing happened, did it?
Of course.
And the people all by then had worked together. One of the other things that we did to try to advance integration, I don't know whether integration is the right word, actually. The coming together of the races and working together was to start. The other thing that I felt was kind of apprehensive about was we started Kutana,
Yes.
a daily half-hour program for blacks, about blacks. Before I came here, there was one black sort of gospel program on Sunday morning. Mm-hmm. And Hugh, what was his name?
Well, Hugh Wilson was a reporter.
Was the reporter here, that's
and
right.
Granville Reed hosted
Granville Reed.
Kutana.
Yes, but there was a black man who was a minister who did a Sunday show.
The name will come to me, but that's right, there was a gospel show. And of course, when you arrived, there were very few black employees.
There were other than janitors, Wesley and maybe one other, there were two black employees, Hugh Wilson, who was a reporter, and there was one black technician who worked in the film lab where he could be hidden. It was insinuated to me, and Glenn Marshall was an incredible general manager. He ran the station for a long time, and he backed up the investigative reports, the documentaries of going after the the problems in Jacksonville.
Even when they weren't very popular among his...
Even those were not popular among the leadership of
Yeah.
Jacksonville. And I admired Glenn, but he said to Catherine Graham, she made me hire those two people. I wouldn't have hired them, but they were hired. But they were the only two non-janitorial employees in the station. And I went about hiring, doing affirmative action. And affirmative action is hard to explain because it doesn't have to be that you had to hire a black or some other minority or a woman.
And you weren't hiring unqualified.
You had to hire qualified people to do it, but there were plenty of qualified people out there. And I had been through that with the companies that I worked for before I came from the Washington Post company. And I used to say, I went to a lot of television stations. I left from here. I managed 4 different Washington Post stations, from the smallest to the largest. And then later became president of a broadcast group. But I used to say, when I would go into a new station, I had an unusual opportunity. It was 1951 when I started in the business, and I was 17 years old. I went to the University of Alabama for a while, and college students couldn't get on the commercial station in town. I was working as a full-time disc jockey announcer at the station, and after 2 years I said, this is silly. But I only had to compete against 40% of the population. I never had to compete against any minorities. I never had to compete against any women. And as I became a general manager, it was, when I would call the staff together early on, it was one of the things I would say was, remember, I had unfair advantages, and probably all of you did. And it's high time everybody had an advantage. And we need to find a way to acquire positive members of all races and genders to come in and be a part of this for several reasons. For instance, as I recall, Granville Reed, who was on Kutana, may have appeared at some of the editorial meetings. Mm-hmm. And so that we had representation for races as well as just all white males.
Well, another visible example of this was Claudette Taylor, a very nice African-American woman who, for more than 40 years, up until recently, was the first person you would see when you walked into the station. She was the receptionist and answered the telephone and did a terrific job. And that was kind of a statement right there out front, very visible.
Yes. But we hired some additional reporters. We hired camera operators.
Yeah. Everywhere.
And everywhere. And engineers, and it was a very compatible group. And the last Christmas party we had before I left, which was just weeks before I left, we had a fairly homogeneous group.
But in 2011, not everybody can fully appreciate what Jacksonville or the South was like in 1968, 69, 70. Throughout the 70s, as you say, no school integration had happened.
Right.
There was the 1954 Supreme Court decision, and for the next 16 years or more, nothing happened.
Right. But it did happen while I was here, mm-hmm. and we came out in favor of it, and the superintendent was in favor of going ahead and doing it. It was not cross-town busing. That was one of the things we wanted to ascertain. There were buses between schools that were 4 blocks apart. And it was clear that it wasn't a necessity. It was pure integration, segregation.
Now, again, putting ourselves in context, we've got this brand new city government, countywide, citywide city government, and I think the early years were watching to see how it was going to work, making sure that it didn't mess up. And what kind of issues do you recall from those years when you were here?
I'm trying to think just what they were, but one of the interesting things to me, I had not been here long, and I'd never met Hans Tansler, who was the mayor at the time, and a white hat. And we took after him on something. It may have been government in the sunshine. It may have been some other issue. But I was sitting in my office. The door was open to the hall so people could see me when they went by. And the editorial board meeting was to start in 15, 20 minutes. And Hans was wandering up and down the halls looking for somebody to talk to. I'm sure he was looking for Glenn Marshall, or who had moved to the Gulf Life Building, or for Leonard Mosby, who he hoped would have some authority. And I went out and introduced myself to him, and he said, "Jim, why is the station after me so?" And I said, "We're going to have an editorial meeting in 15 minutes. Why don't you come in and talk to us?" And so he came in, and we talked about whatever the issue was, and we got along very well. And there were times that he was upset with us, but I think in general they came along very well. My biggest disappointment as manager of WJXT was when it was decided that there would be a University of North Florida. And money was given by land was given by moneyed interests out on what I guess is now 9A or that kind of thing. And they wanted a football team someday, and they wanted it out there. We felt several things. Jacksonville was going through the same kind of slight downtown disintegration that cities were all over the country. And there was plenty of land downtown. And I think you led the cause and wanted to build University of North Florida, downtown Jacksonville. And we started an editorial campaign. Well, all of the big wheels in town wanted it to go where it ultimately wound up, although there, as I understand, there may be some downtown branches now. We had a junior college that was spread around town, but our thought was twofold. One, the University of North Florida was supposed to be a university that would help people with less affluence, that would probably be local people, that the transportation system centered on downtown Jacksonville, that the north side of town was where there were more minorities than there were on the south and southeast side of town. And we fought diligently to editorialize to get that university put downtown, which I think to this day would have been a positive event, because my most recent city to live in was Charleston, South Carolina, and the College of Charleston is right downtown in Charleston. And there's action and activity and so on.
Well, the role model that we looked at, that we pointed to people to help understand what we were suggesting, was Georgia Tech in Atlanta.
Yes.
And it's, not exactly in the middle of downtown, but close enough to be a downtown campus.
And here there was room for it to be just a little bit north of whatever the main department, Ivy's and the other department stores, where there was plenty of room.
Well, that's if you total up your wins and losses, that would be a loss, I guess, in terms of editorial success. But and nowadays we have the University of North Florida, which is a 4-year university with a lot of dormitories and so forth, and it is definitely going to have a football team someday.
Yeah, I didn't know whether it already did.
Not quite.
Oddly enough, the first president was Tom Carpenter, and Tom is a friend of mine. He went from here to Memphis State University, and he now lives in Boone, North Carolina, where we live half the year, and we're close neighbors and close friends. And he never fought; he let it fall out. I hate to tell this story, but the railroad is no longer owned by the newspaper, is it? The newspaper is owned by its own.
That's right. The newspaper is owned by the Morris
family. We felt that the reason that it didn't get through is the legislators and the powerful figures, without names, in Jacksonville wanted it out in the land, out to the east of town. And some legislators who were sympathetic to that cause went to the Florida Times-Union. This was the story. Whether it's true, I don't know, but it's one we lived with. And said, if you don't support moving that university out there, we're going to put require a railroad flagman at every railroad crossing in the state of Florida. Now, whether it was true or not, I don't know, and whether you want to edit this out, I don't know, but I think it was.
Yeah. Well, it's certainly suffice to say that journalism has changed a lot.
Unfortunately.
In the past 40 years, yes, and we could put some more tape in the machine and talk about that for a lot longer. I wanted to ask you a couple of things. One of the highlights, the important chapters in the history of Channel 4 would be the license challenge that came after Watergate. After Watergate, President Nixon was very unhappy with the Washington Post, and I think this is an accurate summation of history. Went after the Washington Post TV stations in Miami and Jacksonville. And a license challenge was basically unheard of. Nobody had their license challenged. It was almost automatic. If you ran a halfway decent TV station, you got your license renewed. So take us back to those days, and to the extent that you're familiar with it, talk about the license challenge.
Well, I went through it all because television stations were renewed every 3 years, so that 1/3 of the states were renewed each year. And when the license challenge came from literally friends of the Nixon administration, I had been manager of WJXT in Jacksonville for 1 year and manager of the Washington Post station in Miami for 2 years. And so I was partially responsible for preparing the defense, and an attorney named Sandy D'Alembert, who subsequently was president of the American Bar Association and then was president of the University of Florida State.
Florida State University, right.
And he was our attorney in Miami. And one of the requirements when you got your license each 3 years renewed, you had to go out and, quote, ascertain the community and talk to citizens and talk to leaders and find out what they felt the issues were that would be required to be met by the public affairs programs. And of course, WJXT had Kutana and had editorial policies that were terrific, had an extraordinary news operation, and did public service programs. So there was little that the challengers to WJXT could do. In Miami, it was a little more difficult. We had not only owned the station a couple of years, and they got a large number of conservative leaders to challenge us, and they filed a lengthy list of ascertainment interviews where they had gone out and interviewed citizens who said, yes, that station could be better, and here's what they didn't do, and things of that nature. Sandy D'Alembert, who was our attorney, went to every person that was interviewed. None of them had been interviewed. They were all fictitious.
Wow.
And I was on the witness stand for 5 days in Washington before an administrative law judge defending our record and what we had done and the programs we did.
They thought they could get away with that.
And they thought they could get away with it. And when it came time for their defense to come on, they removed their objection and went away. And no one else was applying for the license, and we were awarded the license, as was WJXT, but it never happened. But the interesting thing was I was at a broadcasting convention in Washington, and I got a call from Joel Chaseman, who by then was running the broadcast division. And he said, we've got them. He said they have opened some of the Nixon tapes, and in it he is heard to say, they've got television stations. We'll get people to go after them and take Katharine Graham's television stations away from them. So what we had suspected all along. They had tried to deny it and say that it was something that was just a ground roots up effort on the part of people because though we thought we were very fair, by some standards they may thought of us being a little more to the left than the other stations who they might have had more influence with.
But again, it was mostly driven by...
but it was driven by politics.
By Watergate.
And by Watergate. As a matter of fact, Sandy and I actually went to Key Biscayne, to B.B. Rebozo's house. We checked bank accounts. We had reporters down in Bimini. So while it was primarily done by Woodward and Bernstein at the Washington Post, the Miami television stations took place in a part of the Watergate investigations.
And Nixon, if nothing else, was smart. And he knew that television stations were very lucrative.
Yes.
This is an era when television, not that they make money now, but TV stations in those days.
Some of them do.
TV stations in those days were very
profitable businesses.
As was newspapers. So all of that has changed a little bit nowadays.
Yes.
But that was a way of retaliating.
Financially, and to hurt the Washington Post significantly.
So that was a difficult and protracted period.
It was protracted, but it was an interesting experience because we were kind of confident that we were among, I say this, and I give the credit to Katharine Graham, and that was we were very responsible television stations. I give it to Glenn Marshall during the time that he ran the station here. In spite of the racial issues, on everything else, Glenn was very supportive of the news department and investigative reporting, and had a full-time investigative reporter and that kind of thing.
And that's important to have that context when you talk about his blind spot,
yes,
which was race. And it's kind of funny, you referred earlier on that he thought he was comfortable with his successor because his successor was born in Birmingham.
Well, and frankly, he knew my uncle very well, and my uncle was a sincere racist. He had started me in the broadcasting business by taking me to radio stations when I was 6 years old and watching them. And I decided at that time that I wanted to work in radio, because that was before television. And so he had been a major influence in my life, except in that. And he was Glenn was a mild racist.
Oh, sure.
My uncle was not, and he was a very good friend of Glenn's, and so that even further encouraged Glenn to feel good about that.
But all those hard-hitting investigative reports and editorials that rocked the boat and so forth, he stood behind all of those.
Yes, he did.
And that's what you want in a general manager. And so, you know, it's important to have said that before criticizing him about the racial issue.
and I felt that way about him and admired him greatly. We did have a disagreement, and he moved out of Jacksonville because he was upset, and he sat across my desk once and said, "Do you know how many African Americans," that's not the term he used, "you have working here at the station now?" And I said, "I sure do." And I was involved in hiring all of them. And that's when he told me the story about Katharine Graham insisting that he hire Hugh Wilson and the one lab technician so that there would be somebody other than janitors at the...
And, well, the legendary Wesley Stewart.
And the Wesley Stewart.
Yeah, Wesley, who was steadfastly loyal to Mr. Glenn. And his other claim to fame was he created remarkable sculptures out of toothpicks.
I hope you have some of them around.
I wish we did.
Well, you could get one from the Washington Post, because Katharine Graham had one in her office of a ship that Wesley had built. Now, let it be known that Wesley was doing it on company time.
Probably, yeah.
But they were real beautiful works of art.
Well, I wanted to talk a little more about Katharine Graham, too.
Okay.
Her story is very interesting. I mean, you would not have expected her to become the journalism icon that she became.
At one time, the most powerful woman in America.
Yeah. And there was nothing in her earlier years to enable you to make that kind of prediction. And her father had not groomed her to be...
Nor her husband.
Yeah. So, but you knew her and had some experience with her journalism leadership. So, and of course, there's no better example than Watergate. She
stood behind everybody in the department. And she was very strong in saying that the advertising department and the news department will be separated. Mm-hmm. And that she didn't even want the news department to know if an advertiser had resigned or stopped advertising on the station because of the fact that we had done some sort of a news story that offended an advertiser. I met Catherine Graham not too long after I was brought into Washington to meet her by Larry Israel, who was running the broadcast division. And we had a lengthy interview, and I interviewed her. She didn't interview me, which was interesting to me. And she said, we've gone through some troubles, and her husband had committed suicide. And Fritz Beebe, who was the chief financial officer of the company, kind of on an independent way, leading Wall Street executive, had talked her into running the company. And she felt she did not have the experience to do that. But she took it on, and she said to me, we're trying our best to make this a good company. And she was sincere about it. And it was all not apologetic, but it was in a sort of a plaintive way that she was telling me the story to get across to me what she wanted to have happen at this television station.
She would make regular trips to Jacksonville and seemed to really enjoy coming and talking to people at the, she wanted to connect with people throughout the company.
She did. She did not, however, like to make public speeches. She finally got very comfortable at doing it, but because I went from here to Miami, and she had a new television station. I was taking it over after we bought it about 6 months, and she would come and we would take her to the business community and lunches and have her speak and whatnot.
A station named in honor of her husband.
No,
PLG.
PLG, Philip L. Graham. And the next one was Frederick S. Beebe, who was the one who was the chief financial officer, and talked her into
in Hartford.
In Hartford, Connecticut. And she was very nervous about doing them in the early days. It didn't show much in speeches, but we would go to dinner afterwards, and she would say to Joanne, my wife, that is just the worst experience I have to go through to do that. But she was available. She was an elite in many ways because she'd been raised as an elite. Her father was very wealthy. She'd had servants. She lived in a large house and what have you. But when she became head of chairman of the Washington Post Company, she surrounded herself with people like Warren Buffett and a number of public officials. And she had dinners at her house and got to know people. Joanne and I went to dinner one night and at her house in Washington. I was by then managing the Washington station. And she came over and grabbed both our hands and said, I want you to come meet Henry. I want you to come meet Henry. And it was Henry Kissinger, of course. And what do you say to Henry Kissinger? He'd just gotten back from China. And I asked someone who was pretty good at conversation, what would you say to Henry Kissinger? I mean, you don't say, how are things going in politics or that kind of, it would be inappropriate. He said, I would have said, how is the food in China? But we made a conversation of some kind and talked a bit. And Warren was there, and Two interesting people were there. The editor of the Washington Post, whose name escapes me for a moment because I hadn't planned to go there.
Bradley?
Yes.
Ed Bradley.
Not Ed Bradley.
Ben Bradley.
Ben Bradley.
Got it.
He was there, and the very funny columnist for the Washington Post, who had lived in Paris when Bradley had been in Paris, and they were very close, and I didn't think to write his name down, but they sat on either side of Joanne, my wife, at this round table, and there were probably 35 people there, something like that. Some round number of 4 to 8, 32 probably. And she had a large dining room. And they got to talking about Ben Bradley's new book and what should they name it. And they were asking her back and forth. And it was a fun experience for her. And one other experience that she had during Watergate, we were invited to Carl Rowan's house. Carl Rowan was a former member of the State Department, an African American, and he was a columnist on the Washington Post show, Gronsky and Company.
Mm-hmm.
And she was invited to his house, and Judge Sirica was her guest. And she thought, what in the world am I going to talk to Judge Sirica about? And Judge Sirica must have been 55 years old at the time, and he had 2 young children. And all he wanted to talk about were his young children. And it was a fascinating thing. So working for the Washington Post Company, as I did for 13 years, managed 4 different television stations. And working for Katharine Graham was a wonderful experience.
Now you knew when you were 6 years old what you wanted to do. You said an uncle took you to a
radio station.
250 watt radio station.
Well, I think it was a 5,000 watt
Oh.
radio station, but immaterial. It was
Okay.
one of Birmingham's principal. It was owned by the Birmingham News,
Mm-hmm.
and it was WSGN, the South's greatest newspaper, which it doesn't turn out to have been, but that's beside the point.
Yeah. Well, interesting. Call letters meant something.
In those days, yeah.
WSB meant Welcome South, Brother. And WMBR was Miami Beach Radio.
Miami Beach Radio.
Because the station got the license from a Miami Beach radio station and transferred it to Jacksonville.
Well, one of the things I did, and I was worried about cable when I came here, and everyone knew Channel 4 is Channel 4. And I did 2 things. One, I had us superimpose the name of the people who were on the air below them so you'd remember their name. And Bill Grove and I went to lunch at the University Club. And I was telling him this. He was a little hesitant. He was a little afraid of some of the things that I wanted to do that were a little more contemporary and had been done other places. And I wanted his name on the screen some of the time. And 2 ladies were sitting at the next table, and one of them said to the other, "That's our newscaster in town. What's his name?"
Yeah.
and
he thought you'd planted those people, right?
He thought that. And the other thing was, we were known generally as Channel 4. And I was afraid that cable was going to come along, and who knew what was going to happen. So I had us say WJXT Channel 4 in all of our promotions and station identifications and things, so the call letters would be, and lots of people in town knew them, of course, but everybody knew the station as Channel 4.
And in fact, cable was coming a little
And
later.
cable was coming a little later,
Yeah.
and I just felt we needed to have a name as well as a number.
And so what are your, broadcasting has changed so much with cable and satellite and HD and you name it. What are your views of the industry today?
Well, I don't think there are many stations that can afford to have deep news departments. There are some good, still very good television stations. I probably would demonstrate my liberal bias a little bit if I named them per se, but I think there are some good ones. I think there are some fair cable operations. I think there is at least one that is trying to influence America the way it has England with newspapers and so on. I don't think the truth. I learned a lot from Bill Grove. Bill Grove was a wonderful newsman and someone I respected enormously. And we talked a lot. Bill was a shy man, but we talked a lot. And I followed his advice on what to do. We had one of the investigative reporters here found a car dealer that was selling police cars and rolling back the odometers to 25,000 miles. They weren't kidding the fact that they were police cars. They all had 60, 70,000 miles on them. But they were selling them at a reasonable price. But we won't mention the car dealership at the time, but Bill came to me and said, are we going to name this dealer? And I said, I don't know, let me call Glenn Marshall. And I called Glenn and he said, well, let me think about it, I'll call you back. And time went on and suddenly it was 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Bill came and said, what are we going to do? I said, we're going to name them. Glenn had not called me back. 5 o'clock, Glenn called back and he said, don't name them, just say one car dealer in town is doing this. I said, it's too late, Glenn, it's already written. We're going to do it. And we named the dealership and he came to us and said, look, people, I wasn't trying to cheat anybody, but a guy buys a new used car and he drives it up in his driveway. He doesn't want anybody to know it's a former police car with 50 or 60,000 miles on it. And he had all this explanation, but we went ahead with the story, as we should have.
Of course. Out of fairness to the
buyers
dealers who weren't doing that.
Out of fairness to them, although maybe all of them were. But we caught that one easily because we could go to get the serial number, the VIN number, and go to the city and find out what their real mileage was.
Well, Bill Grove, and of course another person that you would mention in the same breath would be Norm Davis, were the driving force behind making Channel 4 what it became.
What it was.
And in the case of Bill, it was totally unpredictable, much like Kay Graham, I guess. He didn't have any training. He'd been a teacher, and he's just kind of evolved and invented local news as much as anything. Who can possibly figure out how that happened?
Yes. Well, and Norm Davis left here and was editorial director in Washington when I came here. When I went to Miami, I hired Norm to be assistant manager. And the principal reason was because the station didn't have the history that WJXT and WTOP-TV in Washington had. And I had a lot to do we had a 3 rating with our news, and Ralph Rennick, who was the #1 person in town, had like a 21 rating.
You had the experience of being Channel 12 in Jacksonville.
Yes.
Against Bill Grove.
And so I had my hands full getting a sales staff, getting promotion right, getting the programming right. And Norm was a perfect person to bring to Miami and help guide the news department. We also hired a man who had been editor and won a national Pulitzer from the Palm Beach Post, Gregory Favre, and then he later went to the Daytona paper, and I came up to Daytona and interviewed him and hired him as news director because we wanted to emulate what WJXT had been. And before I left, we tripled the audience. We were a close third by then, but I had the good fortune of hiring a woman named, actually I didn't hire her. My predecessor, who was only there 6 months, hired her, but I made her an anchor person. Her name was Ann Bishop, and she became the Ralph Rennick of Miami over time and became the #1 newscaster in Miami.
So if you had to take on the job of dealing with the broadcasting landscape as it is today, it would be so different. I mean, there's never going to be a situation where somebody has 70% of the audience again.
I want to talk about that just for a quick moment,
Yeah.
but one of my great worries about this country are monopolies. Almost everything is a monopoly. Every television company owns 50 television stations and things of that nature. And I liked it when we could only own 5 television stations plus 2 UHF stations. And so we had a lot of different owners. And of course, we didn't have 200 cable channels. And I don't know how newspapers, some of the newspapers, without going through names, are very close to being tabloid newspapers. They still fold the same way, but they have a centerfold. But they're small, they're 16 pages, and these are in cities of over 1 million people.
Right.
And so I worry about how we get our news. So many of us receive something that's written by some political organization. If you send it to Snopes, 2/3 of the time they're not true. My grandson is editor of something that AOL has started called Patch. They have about 100 of them around the country, and they do small sections of towns. He does Forest Hill, New York, where Bob Turner, recently became the first Republican congressperson beating Weiner. But he is the editor, and he's got about 4 employees and freelancers, and has people write in, and it's a daily online 7 days a week newspaper owned by AOL. And they're starting them all over the country. They've merged with Huffington Post. And they do local news. They don't try to cover national news. And that's a good thing. Where we get good national news, reporting on, the Washington Post is still a good newspaper, but it's got half the staff it once had. It had 1,500 reporters, and now has 600.
But I'm also equally concerned about local news, and it may not be fair, but I just have a little less confidence in some of what I see online. I know newspapers can be pretty one-sided as well, but I just have a hard time comprehending a world without newspapers, and I mean the newspapers that get ink on your fingers.
Yes. Well, I feel that way, but I also feel that way about television stations. They're full of crime and car wrecks and all of that kind of thing. They don't have Washington bureaus, or they don't. They use the networks.
Or Tallahassee bureaus in the case of.
Does WJXT no longer have? Martin Dykeman was an excellent Tallahassee reporter, and I worry about television stations as well, partly because of their ownership. Anytime a business starts losing money, it cuts back. And the quality of the people, though they may well mean doing good things and so on, are sad relics. I want to tell you about one good newspaper, really good newspaper. I've lived in a lot of places. I've lived in Boston, Washington, Philadelphia, Detroit, Cincinnati, Toledo, Jacksonville, Miami, Palm Beach, Eastern United States. The Charleston Post and Courier is locally owned by the Manigault family. And they concentrate on local news. They primarily carry AP and what have you. But they are the best small city newspaper. Charleston's 300,000 people. But they're conservative, but they have all viewpoints presented in their newspaper, both the syndicated columnists and letters to the editor. They're terrific with letters to the editor, big ones. They give them plenty of space about things they would disagree about. Even they are suffering at this moment. They also put out the Charleston magazine and an incredible magazine called Garden and Gun, which is a funny magazine name, but it's a terrific magazine. And they own some television stations. So there are some good companies around. The Palm Beach Post is an excellent newspaper. I don't know whether it's as good as it was when I lived there. The Miami Herald, I don't know much about anymore. We're not getting the information that we need. We're getting politics now.
And newspapers just made a colossal miscalculation on how to segue into presenting what they were doing online.
Yeah.
And it's too late to go back and do it.
Because they've got too much competition,
Yeah.
and most online operations have some slant that they're feature, whether it's left or right, or
But they were basically giving their product away
yes.
online.
New York Times and the Wall Street Journal are the only two that I'm aware of that actually charge for it. I think the Post is considering it. The Wall Street Journal is a sad comparison to what it used to be, in my opinion. I may get sued by all this. It'll be slander, not libel.
Well, if you were if you were taking a 6-year-old nowadays, you'd bring them to a TV station probably instead of a radio station. Most radio stations there wouldn't be any real people there, but because it's so automated.
Yeah.
But
and run out of one central office, all 700 of them.
someone who might want to take the career path that you took, what would you say in terms of you talking to a class of journalism students or something?
That's a good question. I'm not sure that my grandson, who's the editor of the Forest Park patch, one of 100 AOL patches around the country, called me about a story that he's working on now and wanted to know how to follow up on it and so on. He has a terrific education from Hampshire College in Massachusetts. He wants to be a screenwriter, but a very good friend of mine wrote and won an Oscar for an Emmy and was nominated for an Oscar for Eyes on the Prize, the story of the civil rights movement in America. And he's written a number of documentaries, the George Wallace documentary, The Great Depression, and he says, just write. Just find some job where you can write and hone your skills. But it seems to me with iBook and Kindle, you're probably better off to write a book about what's going on than you are a newspaper. I hate to say that, but people seem to still be interested in books, and the book people know how to market the subject matter, and the unfortunate thing is today almost every American, as opposed to the day of H.V. Kaltenborn and Fulton Lewis and Edward R. Murrow and what have you, read what they believe already. And how we overcome that, I don't know.
Well, 'cause that's a whole other discussion also, is what's happening to the publishing business.
Right.
And people are concerned about a bookless world, that there won't be any books that you can hold in your hand. You'll have to read everything on a Nook or a Kindle.
But I got to tell you, when you're lying in bed, it's easier to read it than it is to turn the pages.
I guess. So, but I guess that's good advice to, and ironically, interestingly, journalism schools still seem to have pretty good enrollments.
And pretty good professors.
Of course, right. And I just wonder sometimes what their plans are as newspapers fold up and go away and so forth. It's still a pretty good bachelor's degree, even though you may not end up working in a newspaper.
The Boone, North Carolina has 2 weekly newspapers. They're both free, and they're better, I won't name them, than some of the large city daily newspapers around. They, if they don't take a position themselves, they give every position an opportunity to be read.
Well, we only have a few minutes, Jim, and I always ask if there's anything that was in the back of your mind that you wanted to mention before we run out of time.
Can I give you a humorous story?
Sure.
The WFGA is a fine television station, and we also had a terrific relationship when I was here with Channel 7. I thought they were one of the really good public television stations in the country. But Channel 12, because they were behind, and Harold Baker was the news director, and they were a very fine group of people. They ran a small ad in the newspaper, in the Times-Union, every day that said, Harold Baker has won this award, or Harold Baker did this, there must be a reason. And this ran for about 3 weeks, and I got annoyed by it. So I bought almost a full-page ad in the Times-Union with just enough space for their ad down here. And the headline was, every night at 6 in Jacksonville, 70% of the people watching news are watching Bill Grove. And a big picture of Bill, and it was this big, and there was still another one of these, there must be a reason, stories, ads over here. We never saw it again. That ended it. But WFGA was a good television station. Channel 7 here was a good television station. So Jacksonville was fortunate, in my opinion, to have it. But WJXT, mine and every manager that has worked here since Glenn Marshall, desire was, Lord, let me leave it as good as I found it.
That's a good point, because it's done well over the years, and
in spite of leaving CBS.
yeah, because speaking of television markets, very strange market, Jacksonville, with Channel 4 now being an independent station. The ABC and NBC station are Gannett,
owned by the same people.
And Clear Channel owns the Fox and CBS stations. So not as much competition as you might think with 5 stations. In effect, you've only got 3 stations.
Yeah. In some respects, that was better, Harry. We did better when 3 of us were fighting than 14 of us were.
Yeah. Well, Jim Lynagh, thank you very much. Very enjoyable conversation, oral history. And
well, it was a pleasure to be here. I always will have a great spot in my heart for you, for Channel 4, for Bill Grove, Leonard Mosby, Glenn Marshall,
right,
and a lot of good people.
Okay. Thank you.